Labour legend John Prescott sadly passed away last week. We'll be taking a look back at the great man's career. We'll also be discussing the government's fallout with farmers and the Assisted Dying Private Members Bill. In part two, we'll be turning our attention to international affairs, Ukraine, the Middle East, COP29 and elections in Ireland and Romania. I'm Frank McKenna. This is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just sort of bigoted women.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den. Me, Frank McKenna, and joined as ever by Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. And guys, we had some sad news last week, not wholly unexpected because John Prescott had quite a long illness, but nevertheless, when a giant of politics such as John passes, it's always a sad occasion. And it's always an opportunity for us to reflect on their achievements, their career, their legacy. And Jim, I guess that you met with Preza on more than one occasion.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I first became aware of John Prescott in the 1960s when there was a seaman strike, and he was involved with that against the Wilson government at the time, and Harold Wilson accused him of being communist. But the main first significant contribution that I reported on was the Labour Party used to have a thing called a block vote, where the big unions would all vote with 3 million members. They'd vote 3 million members for one policy once they'd made a decision. So there was no recognition that within the miners' union there might be dissenting voices. So this was the block vote. This is the way in which decisions were taken at party conference. And John Smith, who was the leader in the early 1990s, wanted to change that. And he got a lot of resistance. And John Prescott, a trade union man to his bones, said, look, this man wants to do this, give him a chance. And they voted for it. And that was the first significant contribution that he made. Then, of course, as has been well known, he acted as this keeping Tony straight, so to speak, in the new Labour government. You know, Tony was a bit slick, wanted to change things, Clause 4 and all that. And Prescott constantly did this commentary on, oh, John's, Tony's all right. He's on our side. He's a progressive, and it was absolutely crucial. Then, towards the end of his time, of course, I became involved with him, and I know this is something you want to discuss, Frank, because it's been a bit underreported in the days since he passed. Is the structure he set up for regional government in this country. Just to remind people, the country was divided up into regions. We had the Northwest, Yorkshire and the Humber, the Northeast, with development agencies. And we had unelected assemblies, which you played a distinguished part, so you'll talk about it with more authority than me. But John then wanted to make those democratic, directly elected organisations so that they would hold the regional development agencies accountable, because there was a criticism, the RDAs just carry on without any real proper scrutiny. And so a referendum was held in the northeast of England, and it was rejected, partly because a new man on the scene, a man called Dominic Cummings, went around with a white elephant, and the people of the northeast voted against it. And I think probably you and I agree, I don't know what Joe thinks, the problem was that Tony Blair, having done Scottish and Welsh devolution, didn't give enough powers to the Assembly to actually make a difference. And the people of the North East thought, and they bought into the claim that there would be a whole lot more politicians. Of course, that was a complete lie, because along with this system, sorry, I'm rattling on a bit here, but it's something I really feel passionately about. They were going to make, underneath it, all the councils were going to be unitary councils. So lots of smaller district councils in Lancashire and places like that would be swept away. And so the net number of politicians would have been less. So you'd have had the Northern Way, which was the huge strategic thing that would have been across the north of England. And who knows, it might have actually dealt with the rail problems that we chronically suffer from now. Then the regional assemblies, holding into account the development agencies, and underneath that, a coherent local government system. That's what John wanted. Tony Blair didn't give him enough powers, probably wasn't particularly interested in it, and it collapsed. Sorry, that's a rather long, but just a tribute to the man. You know, I had my irascible encounters with him, but he was a giant of British politics.
Yes, well, if people are still awake, I'll talk about my sort of reflections on Preza and his career, which is a bit more exciting than what Jim's just explained. I think he was an underestimated man, and it's interesting, Jim, that you say he sort of bought into the Blair vision of New Labour, because actually John Prescott was the first guy to mute the idea of a change to Clause 4, long before Tony Blair thought of the idea. Prescott actually offered that as a suggestion, I think, during John Smith's leadership, actually. And you're quite right, he got the one member, one vote deal through with that rather syntax unfriendly speech that he made to conference. But as Tony Blair said after that punching incident, which we won't go into today because it's been well covered by other media outlets, John will be John, and he had this way of talking, which was not necessarily, as I say, made complete sense, but he always managed to get his point across. In terms of so I think he was underestimated in terms of his vision for Labour. He was always seen as a bit, and I think this is to do with his appearance as much as anything else, the old Labour tradition, when actually he was a moderniser, and he came up with that wonderful phrase, traditional values in a modern setting, which he then used to convince many people who were sceptical about the New Labour project that it was okay to get on that journey and join in with the Tony Blair bandwagon, so to speak. I think the other thing, in terms of what you're saying, Jim, he was a passionate believer in decentralisation. I've had many conversations with him about how Europe was decentralised, and he was an advocate of greater regionalism, which was not something Tony Blair was particularly keen on. Blair was more interested in MERS, which is where we've ended up, really. So there was a difference of opinion, and the reason the North East referendum failed was that actually there wasn't a big campaign in favour of it. The government didn't get behind it in the way that we'd hoped, and of course it all fell apart. Nevertheless, the money that was injected into regional development agencies, particularly the likes of the Northwest Development Agency, which was headed by Steve Broomhead, of course, in this part of the world, made a huge difference. And the investment that went into towns and cities in and around the Northwest, you can still see evidence of that today. And of course, that was replicated across the country. And he was a huge Europhile. Again, people forget that John Prescott wanted the UK to join the Euro. And indeed, as part of the transition from Blair's premiership to Brown, he wanted Brown to sign up to the UK joining the Euro. He failed, obviously, in that sort of objective. But he was, as I say, a visionary in so many ways. And I think his appearance, and then obviously the fact that he did used to get his words mixed up from time to time, he was underestimated by many people, but a great political operator, a fantastic sense of humour, and somebody who will be remembered, I'm sure, as one of the greats, and Deputy Prime Minister, Joe, for 10 years, which is still going, yeah?
Yeah, and, of all the tributes that have been paid, and there have been many over the last few days, I think one of the most heartfelt, actually, and not entirely surprising, has been from William Hague, because they faced each other across the dispatch box often, but they were both very proud of their northern roots. And William Hague was saying on the radio the other day, that they would often used to meet in their offices in the Lords, and he would spend more time chatting and chewing the fat with John Prescott than with people, members of his own party. And I think, we've often talked on this podcast about people who have either got that instinctive political nous, if you like, and John Prescott had it in spades, whether or not it remains to be seen. Keir Starmer can find his, or Rachel Reeves can. But I think also the passing of John Prescott and the way he mentored Angela Rayner does beg the question, why on earth, when you're paying tribute to somebody who brought that to the Labour Party, when you've got the new version sitting there with longer hair and a dress, why aren't you using her to do exactly what Prescott did? You know, go out and talk to people, relate to people, because she gets it, she understands it, she knows where people came from. And just very briefly, isn't it ironic that Jim's talking about, you know, Prescott's vision for local government, and here we are about to see Jim McLean's white paper on a revamp of local government, which would see tiers of local government swept away and a move towards unitary authorities and much more regionalism, which will have a huge impact on the southeast where I'm talking to you from. And I think that would be really significant and something that he would have welcomed.
Absolutely. I think the progressive agenda in terms of decentralisation was taken on board across parties, actually, because the Northern Way transitioned into the Northern Powerhouse. It was not really until you got to Theresa May's government that that agenda fell off a bit of a cliff. And then it was sort of revived by Boris Johnson, but not in any serious fashion. And of course, now Labour are looking at progressing that particular agenda. I think the issue you raised there, Joe, is an interesting one in terms of, you know, Prez's relationship with Blair and the way in which Labour were able to use him as that authentic voice of the government and of the Labour Party at the time. But of course, John Prescott, although he did stand for the leadership in 94, 95, whenever that election was 94, wasn't it? He never really thought he was going to win that election, and actually knew that what that would give him was a platform to win the deputy leadership, which the job he really wanted, because he loved campaigning. He loved being out on the stump. He loved being on the sort of the battle bus, as Jim has described there. But he was never a threat to Tony Blair. You know, he made it very clear he didn't really want to be leader of the Labour Party. He was very, very comfortable as deputy, as number two. I'm not sure you can say that about Angela. And so that could be one of the reasons why you don't see Angela Rayner being given the same sort of platform as John Prescott was, because Blair was as comfortable as John was, and those sort of leadership, deputy leadership role, they both stayed in the lane, and there was never, ever a suggestion from John Prescott that he wanted to one day be leader of the Labour Party or indeed Prime Minister. So I think there is a big difference between the two of them, although I understand the analogy that you make, Joe. But the bigger irony, perhaps, not the fact that Labour are publishing a white paper today or this week, isn't it, on local government reform. I think it's going to be this week. Is it a green paper they're publishing, Joe?
It's a paper.
I think it may be a green paper. Anyway,
it might be a green paper, but it's a discussion paper.
I'm getting as pedantic as Jim. The point I was going to make, the irony, is that the punch that I briefly referred to, and has been the picture that's been shown on every sort of tribute that's been made, it was a farming protest. It was a farmer who he got into a scuffle with. It was the sort of agricultural industry that Labour have fallen out with by the time it came to that 2001 election campaign. And here we are in 2024, and Labour have fallen out with the farmers again, Joe. Now, you know, somebody who's got a bit of a farming background, far more knowledgeable than Jim or I in terms of this industry. What's your take on this? Because it seems to me that, again, and we're saying this every week now, the communications and narrative from the government has been absolutely atrocious, hasn't it? Because in all honesty, when you look at the detail of this thing, it's a reasonable policy. It may need to be tweaked a bit, but by and large, I think the vast majority of the country would support it if it was explained to them properly.
Yeah, and I think the vast majority of farmers would support it had it not been out of the blue. Apparently, Steve Reid, the Environment Secretary, didn't know about it until the day before the budget. And I think part of the problem is that the government doesn't make clear which figures it's working on. And if you're saying, oh, it only affects a few farmers, well, then why are you making such a meal and having such a battle out of something that's not going to work? I mean, the bottom line is there are an awful lot of wealthy people, Jeremy Clarkson included, and by his own admission, but people like James Dyson and Andrew Lloyd Webber, who have bought up thousands and thousands of acres of farmland. Now, they might put on a pair of Wellingtons at one point in the year, but they're not actually farming it. And it is there as a vehicle. It's an investment and, possible tax efficient vehicle for very wealthy people. And you can talk to many farmers, particularly around the sort of the Midlands, Buckinghamshire, that sort of area, Lincolnshire, and they'll tell you, these aren't farmers, these are wealthy people who just own the land. But the government, as you absolutely say, Frank, have got it so spectacularly wrong. And what it looks like is class war. And what it looks like is not understanding that food security, how farming works, which is you don't suddenly say, oh, I think it's Monday, I know, let's go and plant some carrots, I'll have them in the shops by Thursday. You are planning ahead. My sister and brother-in-law, they've just put the rams in with the sheep for next year's lambs. You're always planning ahead. We know what the weather's been like. That's going to have knocked back an awful lot of planting, particularly around Wales and parts of the Midlands where they've been so badly flooded. That will have an impact on food prices. So we need farming. We need to understand the relationship between farming, food security, and our own self-sufficiency, if you like, as a country, particularly in the light of Brexit. And the government have got it completely wrong in the way they've explained this. So you end up with, no, this is about very wealthy people. And lots of people say, oh, but farmers are wealthy. Well, actually, they're not. They might be asset rich, but they are cash poor. And I know because I grew up on a farm, it's 7 days a week, 365 days a year, regardless of the weather. It's bloody hard, but it's a choice people make. And nobody's saying they shouldn't make that choice. But I just think, why didn't they, Minette Batters is one of the most sensible women sitting in the House of Lords, the former president of the NFU. Why didn't they talk to people? I think both of you have said, roll the pitch, roll the pitch. We've said it about so many things, and they've done it again on this, and they've done it as they did on the winter fuel allowance, and they're now getting today, the CBI conference and all the rest of it, and they've now got businesses turning. So I think, the farming thing, I don't think Rachel Reeves will back down, but there are easy ways to change it. You just raise the threshold to 2 million, for instance, or you explain it, but there is no point in saying, oh, it's not going to affect many people, and anyway, you can work around it. Well, why bloody well do it in the first place then?
Yeah, if you can avoid it, why implement it? I mean, I just think the narrative, they've lost it again. They've lost control of the argument. And I've been trying to study the detail of this new legislation, of what was announced in the budget. Now, the claim is this is going to affect 70,000 farmers. In fact, every independent analysis of this change says it's going to be in the low thousands. And again, I think you can make a case to say, well, why shouldn't farmers pay inheritance tax? But the big thing is this point that you make, Jeff. If you're really concerned about the future of farming and food security, then you've got to find a way of stopping people buying land basically to avoid inheritance tax. And exactly. Jeremy Clarkson has admitted that's what he did. Yeah. So instead of rolling the pitch and saying we're going to make this change because Dyson, Clarkson and people like this are buying up our land, which should be used for farmers, should be used for food and food security agenda, we get into this row. And I've not really seen Labour politicians making a case for it. It's just, well, these are the changes we've made, crack on. Jim, it just seems to me there is no politics in this government. It really is depressing. Every single week, a new issue emerges and your head's in your hands because they're just not getting their messaging right.
Yeah, it's reminiscent of the hunting ban, and it's quite interesting to compare the two because in terms of the court of public opinion, which is what you're talking about, with hunting, I think there was some sympathy for the way of life that was being allegedly destroyed in the countryside around the whole the issue of hunting and what it meant to people who lived quite isolated lives and came together for hunt meets and so on. People could see that, but on the other hand, the animal cruelty thing was a big issue with the public. With this, there's a great danger for the government that the farmers will be able to pitch food security, which is a big issue now, against what the government are doing. And I think, you know, they'll have to take that into account. And of course, we've got it's a perfect storm in a way, because unusually we have about 100 or more Labour MPs representing rural constituencies, and I would venture to suggest they are already toast, because this is doing such damage in the rural communities that it'll be a long time before they forget it. And whatever happens in turning the government around, I think they might as well already start to look for other jobs. And it struck me also that, as you said, Minette Batters is a very polite person. The president of the National Farmers Union was a very reasonable guy on the in the studios. And the protest itself was good natured. There was no violence, nothing at all. It was really, with the kids on their little mini tractors and so on. That was just brilliant PR. And it goes to your point, Joe and Frank, that you know, people find it so easy to pitch their case against a government which is in disarray. I mean, just two things on the actual legislation itself. There's heavy pressure on Rachel from Accounts, as she will now be known, because of her liberal interpretation of her credentials for being Chancellor of the Exchequer, may have to move particularly on the over 80-year-old farmers, because, you know, we've talked about this as sudden shock. These people have planned their finances, and people who are in their later years, you know, and they're facing the prospect of you know, huge inheritance tax bills. I think they'll have to make some modification on that front. And also, Frank, you made a good point. Surely it's not beyond the wit of man to identify which are working farms and which is speculation. Yeah. You know, that you can get the accounts of farms, the Treasury can do the work, and that's how you would crack down on this tax gap.
At the moment, all you have to do is sign a declaration to say this is a working farm. There is nothing to, you know, whereas any of us who are self-employed, or any self-employed builder or painter and decorator or anything else knows, you've actually got to have some proof. And the other thing that, you know, could be a very, very ghastly knock-on effect of this is if people start selling off farmland, which I think should be absolutely protected and not be allowed to be built on for food security as well as preserving the countryside. You know, that will happen, that people will sell off parcels of land to try and shore up, either to make their farm less valuable and therefore under the threshold, or to try and raise funds to pay inheritance tax. And it doesn't matter if you say, well, they're only paying 20% over 10 years, which is half what everybody else pays, and, you know, the farmers have got it interest free. That isn't the point. It's about forward planning. And the government have just... I will just tell you one thing that I found extraordinarily cheering, given what we say every week about how badly wrong they get it. I was at a talk last week with Anthony Selden, who, as you know, has written biographies of every prime minister since the war. I mean, he actually predates Jim, I think, on knowledge.
I wondered how long it would
be. Anyway, it was a room of about, I don't know, 100, 150 people. And he was talking about, you know, why Truss and Johnson failed and what Starmer could learn from those failures and all the rest of it. And he said, right, put your hands up, everybody who thinks that by the time we get to the next election, Keir Starmer will have got it right and will be one of the best prime ministers. So about half the room put their hands up. And then he said, okay, put your hands up, those of you who want that to happen. Every single hand in the room went up. And I thought that was really interesting, that people want Keir Starmer to succeed, but he and his government are shooting themselves in the foot. And the farmers is a perfect example of that.
I think the worrying thing for me in terms of this particular issue is the fact that we were complaining it was taking them so long to get the budget done. It was 4 months. And that gives them more than enough time to look at these issues, to see what pitfalls there potentially are, and to talk to the National Farmers Union and others to say, how can we make this work? We obviously want to penalise people who are buying this as a tax dodge. Nothing illegal about it, but nevertheless, Clarkson, as I say, admitted in an interview with the Sunday Times back in 2021, I bought this land in order to avoid inheritance tax. So we want to tackle that problem. We want to take seriously the food security agenda. Can you help us put a policy together that enables us to achieve those objectives? The fact that Stephen Reid didn't even know, the minister responsible didn't know until the day before, tells you that that didn't happen. Again, it strikes me as it's the Treasury throwing numbers at Rachel Reeves, saying, well, you can save this from winter fuel allowance, you can save this from the farmers' inheritance tax. These are easy things to take. They're not looking at the politics of it. As I say, this is what is really depressing. And the final point I'll make on this, just to slightly disagree with Jim's point, I get what you say in terms of the pictures that were shown on the television of the kids on the little tractors and all of that sort of thing. But I tell you, if you've got half a brain and you've got Jeremy Clarkson fronting that campaign, then you're sat at home thinking, hey, mate, you don't need the tax break. Why are you getting tax breaks that I, as a normal business owner, don't get? And then when you see Farage on that march, a guy whose campaign to take us out of the European Union has done far, far more damage than anything that Rachel Reeves has done will ever do to the farming industry. And then Kemi Badenoch, who did trade deals that the farmers were furious about when she was the trade minister. And I just think that, again, a decent communication strategy from the Labour Party could have absolutely bulleted that particular day of protest. Said, well, okay, guys, we may have to look at this again, but look at some of the allies that you're lining up with here. I think that might come to bite this particular campaign on the bum. And I also wondered, Joe, whether it was wise for Ed Davey to be sharing a platform with Nigel Farage, whatever the issue might be.
No,
because
I completely.
If it was Corbyn sharing a platform, in fact, he did do this, didn't he, on occasion, with people who he would say, oh, that's a bit distasteful from the left. And yet Ed Davey thinks, oh, it's okay to get on a platform with Farage. I thought that was a bad mistake by him.
I think it was a mistake. I think, luckily not many people noticed, but I do think, except obviously now the thousands who are listening to this podcast. But
millions, Joe, millions.
Millions. What do we say? Bootle to Bucharest, any time you like. I think it was a mistake. I think it was ill-judged. And I understand that the Farmers Union, the NFU, did not want Nigel Farage to speak. They didn't want Jeremy Clarkson to speak either because it would hijack it. But I mean, of course, the media are going to go for those people because they're media performers. And they do want to hear from that because they know what they're going to get. I think it was ill-judged for Ed Davey. I mean, he could have put Tim Farron up, an environment spokesperson for the Lib Dems or something like that. You could always say, we are cross-party, we are united in our concern for the countryside or whatever. But I think for a party leader, particularly one who's been doing quite well thus far, it's a bit silly. The only thing I would say is just think of the increase in sales for Barber jackets and those dreadful yellow trousers from all of those people. They virtually got the labels still hanging off them, hadn't they?
Unbelievable. I tell you what would have done Ed Davey a bit of good in a lot of people's eyes, including the farmers on that protest, if he'd have actually referenced Brexit and said, well, we're all here today and this is a bad thing, but and they won't go near it. It's just driving me crackers. They'll have to get there in the end. All of them will have to acknowledge it in the end because it is losing the country billions of pounds. And unless and until Labour can reset that agenda with the EU, then this growth agenda that Rachel Reeves keeps talking about is for the birds, I'm afraid. Anyway, we'll move on to another controversial issue and another issue that I'd have to say, and I hate to say this, I hate to constantly criticise the government, but the politics of this particular thing have got out of hand as well, because Keir Starmer, obviously in conversation with Esther Ransom pre-election, promised a vote on an assisted dying bill, and that is before Parliament on Friday. It's being presented by Kim Ledbetter. For those who don't know, Kim is Jo Cox, the MP who was murdered so tragically a number of years ago now. She's her sister, and Kim has been fronting this thing. And Starmer at the outset said no government ministers will be commenting on this issue. Well, the Health Secretary and now the Justice Secretary have said that they are going to vote against the bill. And it seems to me that on Friday the vote may go through but it's far more controversial than I think Starmer had appreciated. And I think, as I say, the politics haven't been handled particularly well. When you look back at other big changes that have been made in social policy, governments have never been agnostic. They've always taken a view. Roy Jenkins championed the legalisation of homosexuality. The government were firmly in favour in the 60s of abolishing the death penalty. David Cameron put his weight behind gay marriage. Now, these issues, you can say that they're sensitive, but to just abandon your responsibility as a government to lead in these areas, Starmer believes that assisted dying is a policy that ought to be introduced. Then he should have got behind it more, in my view, Jo.
Yes, I mean, I think they have failed to explain what is happening with Kim Ledbetter's private members bill. It's being debated on Friday when most MPs are going to be in their constituencies. So it remains to be seen how many people actually turn up. Mm-hmm. And it is not the bill that would become law. It is the beginning of a process. So all the concerns that people have quite validly raised about safeguards against coercion, and so on and so forth, would be gone through as the bill progresses, in the same way as any other bill progresses through Parliament and ultimately to the Lords and then back to the Commons. So I think, they haven't explained it properly, that this is really a sort of an expression of intention, if you like. And there is plenty of time for people, because everybody's going, oh, no, there's not enough time. 2 weeks isn't long enough. Well, of course, 2 weeks isn't long enough to talk about assisted dying in the entirety, but that's not going to happen. It's not going to become law on Monday if it gets through on Friday. So I think they've failed on that thing. I think the problem with the cabinet ministers, I think, Wes Streeting, fine, he's entitled to his opinion, and if asked, I think you can say what you want, but he then made a mistake of saying he was asking NHS officials or Department of Health officials to look at the costs of it. Well, that is way out of his remit. Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, she's obviously got a point to make. She's a Muslim MP and cabinet minister, and that's fine. But then you're creating a religious division, and I think you've got that problem in a way, like all of these issues, whether it's capital punishment, abortion, same-sex marriage, or whatever. You've got the problem that those who are fervently against will not move, in the same way as those are fervently for will not move. It's the ones in the middle, and of course the big problem is that you've got an awful lot of very young, very inexperienced MPs who probably, as Margaret Hodge said, can't remember how to think for themselves. Mm. And this isn't a vote that's going to see you get up the greasy pole of government. It's got to be your conscience. And a lot of them will find it very difficult to find that conscience because it's been beaten out of them in discipline of doing the party line. So we'll see what happens on Friday.
Jim?
Right. I profoundly disagree with everything that you've both said. First of all, I mean, not in any particular order, I think there'll be a very big attendance in the House of Commons on Friday. I don't think that many MPs will be in their constituencies, and I think we'll see Parliament at its very best when it's discussing these great issues, whether it's in vitro fertilisation, hanging, homosexuality. This is actually a rare opportunity where people can see democratic debate going on. So I think there'll be a big attendance there. I think the government are right not to take a government position on this. I mean, I'm hoping we can move on to the issues of this because I really don't think this
you have to be quick then, Jim.
Yes, okay.
We're on your stopwatch.
Okay, right. So I think it's right that the government don't take a position on it. However, I think it was wrong of Simon Case to try and ban cabinet ministers speaking. I value the contribution of these two ministers, Wes Streeting talking about palliative care, that's his expertise, and Shabana Mahmood talking about how judges are going to be involved in this. I wanted to hear from it. So moving on to the issue itself, I am against this bill. I think it's absolutely right to debate it, and we have to acknowledge that polls apparently show the public in favour of it, but the public were in favour of hanging, and Parliament voted to change it. So, MPs we've elected them to use their judgment. I'm concerned about coercion. I think this is the biggest issue of all. Whether it's overt coercion or it's people feeling, oh, I'm a nuisance, I'm costing the NHS, or I'm hanging around. I think this will be massive, and there's evidence for the slippery slope of this. In Belgium now, rarely, I accept, but rarely children with terminal illnesses are subject to this legislation. And I was astonished that in Canada, the 2022 figures, I hope you don't realise this, is not a few people, 12,000 people use the law in Canada. And finally, this business about getting two doctors and then going to a judge who's got to decide on all these cases. And there's 12,000 in Canada. How many are there going to be here? A judge is not in the position to make a judgment on medical matters. So I understand the problems of agonizing death, but I think Wes Streeting is spot on. The first thing to do is to improve palliative care and not undermine the wonderful work that's done in hospices. We've got a national health service, not a national death service.
As somebody who watched my dad lose all his dignity over a period of 6 months and would have very happily signed for the opportunity to take a far more dignified way out of this world, then I am very much in favour of assisted dying. And my dad wasn't the only one that I've seen suffer in that way. I've seen many individuals go through that. We put bloody animals down because they're suffering, yet we can't do it with humans. So I think the case on an emotional level is easy for me to make. I would also say that, in terms of this two-class system that we have in terms of assisted dying, so you got the cash, Jim, you can go to Switzerland. Sadly, my dad didn't have the money to do that, but Esther Ranson will do that if she needs to. She'll just bugger off abroad and say, right, stick the needle in my arm, please. I'm suffering too much. And her family won't have to go through all the suffering that me and my family had to go through, watching my dad, as I say, lose all his dignity. So I think, there is an emotional case that I would certainly be able to make for assisted dying. The point I'm making about these big social changes that are made and introduced by government, whether it's always very usually made through private members' bills, very unusual for governments not to take a position. And that's where I think they've got the politics wrong. And it's easy to say to ministers, and they have in the past, you can abstain on the vote. But the government's position on this particular issue is X, Y, or Z. To not take a position, I think, is a little bit cowardly, actually, because Starmer has clearly made the commitment for the assisted dying bill to be introduced, and therefore obviously supported being passed, I would have thought. Whether enough time, consultation is perceived to be in place, I think it is questionable. But Joe makes the point, this is the first reading. It would go to the Lords, it would have big consultation, big debate, and presumably you could introduce the legislation in a transitional way to enable the things that you're worried about, Jim, to be tackled and to be secured. But again, I come back to the point, the politics of this. Why introduce a bill as controversial so early in the Parliament? Why not get your ducks in a row? Why not have those conversations and make sure that the government has got a clear line? So I think the politics have been awful. My thinking is that this bill will fail ultimately, if not on Friday, then at the second reading, because I don't think that there will be enough government time given. I think it'll be kicked into the long grass. And I tell you this, if it doesn't get done this time, it's another generation before it's properly discussed.
And that is the problem, Frank, that, if it goes, when was the last time? 2011, I think it was debated. So, if it doesn't happen this time, it will be, 2-3 parliaments time at least. And I totally agree with you on the dignity issue. And in fact, Matthew Syed wrote a brilliant piece in the Sunday Times yesterday, and he said, no drug, however sophisticated, can anaesthetize indignity. And my mum's 94, she's blind, she's got Alzheimer's, she's in a care home, she's doubly incontinent, she wouldn't know if she was in a garden shed, and I know that she would absolutely hate to be like that, but there's absolutely nothing we can do about it, and she's not in a fit mental state to make a decision. And I think the other thing, just briefly, because I know we need to move on to other things, part of this is removing the criminality. And I think that's an important thing to say, is that this is very, very limited to people who've only got 6 months left prognosis, and they have to administer the drug themselves. Now, if you assist somebody, whether you accompany them to Switzerland or not, and that's the point about Esther Rantzen, she might be able to afford to go there, but she's worried about any of her family coming back and being potentially arrested as accessories to helping suicide. So I think, there's a whole load of nuance. Let's hope Jim's right and it does allow us to see Parliament at its best on Friday.
Yeah, I'm not convinced, but we will see. We will see. And it's an issue that sadly we will come back to. And I think, it's one of those issues that shouldn't be dividing people politically. We all have very good reasons for taking the position that we take. But I just think that it's been introduced, as I say, far too early in this Parliament. There should have been more thought given to it. And those issues that are being raised by people like Jim, very reasonably, in terms of whether the safeguards are in place, that they needed to get that sorted before they got the private members' bill into Parliament as quickly as they have. Anyway, it's an issue, as I say, I'm sure we will come back to in future weeks. After the break, we'll be going geopolitics. We're going international, lots happening on foreign shores. So stay with us. We'll be back in a minute. Okay, welcome back to the second part of the Downtown Den Politics podcast. Me, Frank McKenna, Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock, and we've focused on domestic issues in the first part of the programme, so we're going to go geopolitics now, and let's start with Ukraine. And of course, the big news is that the United States, the UK, it looks like France and Germany, now allowing Ukraine to fire missiles that are made in those countries, manufactured in those countries, donated by those countries, into Russia itself. Now, Joe Biden in particular has been criticised on two fronts. One, from those who are very pro-Ukraine, saying, well, too little, too late. Two, he's in his transition period. Donald Trump made it very clear in the run-up to the presidential election that he was not in favour of escalating the war in any way. And been suggested to me, at least, that if the boot was on the other foot and it was a Democrat ready to move in the White House and a president started to make major moves on foreign policy, us Democrats would be up in arms. So, Joe, the Ukraine situation, Putin obviously unhappy with those changes of policy from NATO countries. What are you making of it all?
I think it's slightly frightening, but not as frightening as perhaps Putin would like to make it. I think what is clear that there is perhaps a shift in Zelensky and Ukraine's thinking and recognizing that there is going to have to be a diplomatic, for want of a better word, solution to this, because the war's been going on for a long time. There's an awful lot of deaths on both sides. There's an absolutely staggering amount of damage to Ukraine. People are tired. People are facing a winter. And I think the question is that can Ukraine go to the negotiating table with the support of its European allies, in which case it's got a little bit more heft. And I think that's all about timing, because at the moment, you know, the missiles being fired into Russian space, Russian territory, it's symbolic, but it's not, you know, they're not going to bomb the Kremlin. They can't reach that far.
A game changer, is it?
Yeah, exactly. But I do think, you know, it's about leverage, and I think it falls on Europe and NATO. It's interesting, isn't it? Angela Merkel's autobiography is out this week, so she's doing a lot of interviews, and of course she was the one that blocked Ukraine from joining NATO. And I heard her interviewed this morning, and she was saying, well, you know, the war would have started sooner. And you think, well, yeah, but the war might have been over sooner, actually. So I think, you know, it's moving into a different phase. I think, you know, Trump said he could have it finished in a day. Well, probably only if he basically said, yeah, Putin, do whatever you like, and we'll just turn a blind eye. But I think it all depends on European support for Ukraine in negotiations, and backing that up with, you know, if you then go beyond the territory that is agreed, we will come and get you. So we'll see.
Jim, what do you make of Biden's belated move? Because he's had, you know, a couple of years, well, over 1,000 days to make that decision. And as I say, the criticism, even from pro-Ukrainians, is, well, too little, too late, mate.
Well, he's saying that the trigger for his allowing these weapons to be used is the arrival of the North Korean troops. And he's saying that was crossing a red line, and that was an escalation on the Russians' part. And therefore, that justifies it. Also, I mean, this is probably a slightly reckless opinion, but Donald Trump has broken so many rules of protocol and how to do things that there's something in my gut which says good old Joe for putting one in his eye in his last few months. He's still president of the United States, and he can do what he wants and follow through on the policy, but that's probably slightly reckless. The key thing is, as I think I said last week, if there are going to be peace negotiations next year, it would be handy if the Ukrainians during this winter could actually make some territorial gains and be on the front foot. Because if, you know, the peace negotiations are held against a background where it's quite possible that the Kursk salient is eliminated and the Russians continue to make grinding progress in the Donetsk, they will go to those peace talks with the upper hand. So if this can make some difference to that, fair enough. One last point: I don't know if you've heard the news that apparently the Russians have got a British soldier. I put that in inverted commas, but he's because apparently the Ukrainians right from the beginning advertised for British, French ex-servicemen. These are not in the British Army, but they volunteered to fight in Ukraine. And of course, the Russians have got this guy, and it plays to their narrative that this is a war against NATO and the British directly. And we'll see how that plays out. I feel very sorry for the man, but I mean, you know, if you go into these things as you call them mercenaries, or you call them brave volunteers for the Ukrainians, but that's the story that's going to develop, along with another thing that happened yesterday: these mysterious drones over US bases in England, you know, over Lakenheath. We can only presume that must be Russian activity, as we're also seeing in the Baltic Sea, where the underground cables are being attacked. So you can, you know, I think Joe's right. This sort of bluffing about nuclear war is wrong, but you can see what the Russians are going to do. They're going to step up all this collateral stuff. So, you know, and with so many other issues to be resolved around the world. I mean, we talked to people of South Wales this morning about climate change and things like that. So much more that needs to be done on other fronts. It's just so depressing and tragic.
And I think that disruption, you know, and cyber attacks is something that Pat McFadden is flagging up in a speech today. So, yeah, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be nuked, but it does mean that the Russians will be targeting us for other forms of attack, which will very much inconvenience us, but not as much as the Ukrainian people have been inconvenienced. Hey, so it's all relative. I do think that the negotiated settlement, as you've indicated, Joe, is getting ever closer, and yeah, Zelensky is probably looking at this in a far more pragmatic way now. Whether Trump is going to be as generous to Putin as people are making out remains to be seen. And again, there are some more positive noises from our perspective coming out of the States, suggesting that the big carrot that Trump is going to offer Putin actually a lifting of economic sanctions rather than just have what you want, mate, in terms of land grabs. So we will see, but yeah, maybe not going to be as bleak as we had assumed. Moving on then to the Middle East, and this is just it's a terrible, tragic situation now. And as much as we were the first to sympathise with Israel, criticise rightly the horrendous terrorist attack on the country by Hamas on October the 7th, my feeling now is this has just gone way, way beyond what is a reasonable retaliation. And when do you draw the line? Well, the International Court of Opinion has drawn the line and is now saying that Netanyahu is a war criminal. Again, Israel, across the political spectrum, are saying, well, this is anti-Semite, and they've dug in. But for me, Jim, you look at some of the pictures, you look at the fact that humanitarian aid has been blocked, that people are being starved to death, kids are suffering malnutrition. If it was Putin, if it was another part of the world, we would have had no hesitation, would we, in saying this is a war crime?
Yes. I mean, obviously, we do these podcasts to offer our opinions and possibly always come down on one side or the other. And I am literally on the fence on this. I mean, clearly, Israel is subject to the criticism. It's a massive overreaction to the horrible events of October the 7th. And you know, there's no doubt at all that war crimes have been committed on both sides. I mean, the International Court have arraigned the Hamas leaders, although a lot of them are dead, of course. And so this is a massive overreaction in one sense. But the reason that I'm hopelessly on the fence is that only yesterday Hezbollah were firing more missiles into Israel. I mean, it's incredible that with all this destruction in Lebanon, I thought the Israelis would have got to most of their targets now, but Hezbollah are still able to rain in rockets. And so when, you know, Israeli spokesmen say, what other country on earth would tolerate its neighbors lobbing missiles into its territory as it likes? I haven't got an answer for that. So I'm sorry I can't come down on one side or the other. You know, it clearly is a massive, terrible sort of overreaction by Israel. But what's overreaction if you face the prospect of going to the peace table, knowing that the whole thing's just going to build up again and there'll be more rockets lobbed into your country from the neighbors? You know, we know what the answer is peace, getting the Arabs with their limitless funds to reconstruct the area, two-state solution. We know what this solution is. But we've got Netanyahu who's out of control, frankly, and he's partly out of control because of this interim situation in the United States. Again, it'll be interesting to see what Donald Trump does. Is he going to? I mean, it appears that he's on Netanyahu's side, but when he's actually president of the United States, is he going to do anything to try and resolve this and end this dreadful war?
Some good points well made, Jim. Joe?
I'm sorry, but I think I am not on the fence on this. I think Netanyahu has pursued this with vigor and brutality to shore up his own position. And I think the absolutely unforgivable attacks on schools, hospitals, refugee camps, aid convoys, and medics, and then saying, oh, we think, you know, Hamas are hiding out there, coupled with the fact that they will not allow the BBC to go in to report into Gaza. And I think, you know, what Israel is doing is building up an absolute bank of hatred against it, when actually people have given them quarter, they have allowed them a little bit more leeway because of all the reasons that Jim has just said. But, you know, we saw what happened when Obama said about Bashar al-Assad in Syria. if you use chemical weapons, you've crossed a red line. Well, he crossed a red line and nothing happened. I mean, at what point do we as an international community not say, you can't herd people up into one area and then bomb them when you've got there? You can't starve people to death. You know, that was Stalingrad, for God's sake, in the 1940s. What is happening, and the way that I'm afraid most of the world is turning a blind eye to it because it's too horrible, is actually storing up so much trouble for the future.
I think the Arab nations in and around Israel, Palestine, that's going to be the big worry for me, their reaction in the future moving forward. And international law, what does it mean if countries, because they are perceived as liberal democracies, are sort of given more leeway than other nations would be? And yeah, it's a difficult one, Jim. You're absolutely right. It's a very, very complex situation, but I just think that most people now are looking at this thinking, oh, way too much, way over the top. And I'd have to agree with you, Joe. I think Netanyahu is using this as his sort of last hurrah and protecting himself, because let's not forget, he wouldn't allow a investigation into why October the 7th happened, because it was on his watch, wasn't it? And the lack of defence that he provided enabled that attack to happen. So Netanyahu, without question, has been culpable in so many ways for this latest in a long, long, long line of tragic incidents in that part of the world. It's not called the forever war for nothing, is it? Let's move on then to climate change, which you've already referenced, Jim, and COP29. What's been happening there, Joe?
An awful lot of talking. Keir Starmer went. An awful lot of world leaders didn't. We discussed that last week, and Ed Miliband has been there. It's been going on for 2 weeks. I mean, you sort of think, oh, good Lord, is it still going on? Anyway, they came out with eventually an agreement that richer countries would stump up the funds to help developing countries combat the effects of climate change. But I'm afraid it is very difficult to look at these things and think about the cost of running it, whether it should have been run in an oil-rich country, Azerbaijan, whether anything actually meaningful comes out of these conversations and these talks. And I'm afraid I don't think it helps the net zero climate change debate, because people just see it as a talking shop where lots of wealthy countries and those interested lobbyists will be basically working out ways to do greenwashing. Meanwhile, you know, there are many countries around the world who are really, really feeling it, and time's running out.
And it's an issue that it seems to me is going to be even more difficult to cope with, Jim, when Trump is elected, does take over the presidency in January, because he's not going to continue to support whatever is signed at COP29, is he?
No, and I think that fact that that's about to happen was one of the factors that caused the problems in Azerbaijan. I mean, as I understand it, you need to have a really good chair, and I'm not sure the Azerbaijan chair was putting enough definite proposals earlier on that people could actually negotiate on. There was, as you say, 10 days of sort of general talk, and then the clock's ticking and they have to come up with something. I mean, they have come up, as I understand it, with £240 billion for the countries most severely affected. It's not the trillion that they wanted. But nevertheless, you know, the show is still on the road. A show that John Prescott, of course, was heavily involved in Kyoto, where I think we particularly mentioned that earlier. But we have to just put this in the context of public opinion. And we've seen Ed Miliband get into a controversy because he's thinking of penalising people that make boilers, and if they don't make enough heat, the new heat boilers, pumps, heat pumps, and they will be penalised. And of course, the papers are all criticising him for it. So every time the domestic governments try to inch forward on climate change and impinge a bit on our lifestyles or on our pockets, there is a bit of a press back. But and I'm not being facetious, but the evidence is for anybody who doubts, and whether this changes public opinion, the ravaging of the United States with 2 massive storms. This storm Bert, I mean, obviously I can talk to you because I know a bit about meteorology, and you can explain a lot of low pressure systems being just the natural way of things. But the fact of the matter is, the warmer the atmosphere gets, the more water it has, and the more the people of South Wales this morning are being flooded by it. So will public opinion actually take on board this thing, which is a long-term thing, that they won't actually, well, they are being affected, but the solutions are longer term, and tell politicians, yes, we do want heat, we do want taxes on carbon fuels, we do want our houses insulated, and we're prepared to pay for it. There will be these COP after COP, because the politicians going there will have in the back of their minds reluctant voters. If there is that sea change, particularly in the industrialized country, where the public are behind it, really behind it, because they see the evidence, because of the way the weather is, then maybe COPs will be more successful.
Or they may change the name to COP Out. We will wait and see, James. We will wait and see. Right, on to 2 elections that are taking place this week. One very close to home in Ireland, the other in Romania, which only sort of hit my radar this morning. Some quite alarming news coming out of the Romanian poll. Oh, get my teeth in. Ireland. Now, this election sort of snap poll that was called by Simon Clarke, the leader of Fine Gael, and it was all on the basis that Sinn Féin had taken a tumble in the polls on the back of a number of scandals that had hit some of their leadership. However, the poll going into the election is that they are now within 4 points of Fine Gael at Sinn Féin. They have recovered quite well during the election campaign itself. And immigration, again, is rearing its head as, if not the number 1 issue, then certainly one of the key issues that is exercising voters' minds. And then I don't think Simon Clarke has had a particularly good time on the stump either, Joe. You were relaying a story to me earlier that I wasn't aware of. So what's going on in Ireland, Joe?
So the election's on Friday, leaders debate tomorrow, Tuesday. Simon Harris, I think his name is.
Simon Harris. Simon
Clarke may be having a bad week, but probably not as bad as
Simon Harris. Tom Cleverley's the manager of Watford.
Hey,
Anyway.
It's my inner John Prescott.
Well, that's all right. The best thing John Prescott, he said, when he got off a plane, he'd been on some, round the world journey doing something or other, and he got back and he landed and he said, "Oh, it's great to have your feet back on terracotta." Anyway, Simon Harris was accosted by a disability care worker, and he didn't punch her. He did actually what was slightly worse. He just walked away, which at its very least looked incredibly rude, and went out of a back door on this visit. So that's not done him any favours. I think the general thinking is that it's going to be between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, that they will somehow, they alternate the Taoiseach, the presidential, primary role. But if Fine Gael were to win, it would be their 4th successive run. Sinn Féin have gone up a little bit, as you said. Does it make much of a difference? No, but it's interesting that the same topics again and again. It's cost of living and immigration are the number, and public services.
Yeah, it is interesting to watch. And then moving on to this Romanian election, James, and the headline that sort of woke me up this morning: Ukraine war latest. Ukraine support at risk as far-right anti-NATO candidate wins most votes in shock Romanian election result. Quite astonishing when you think of the recent history of Romania, a country, of course, that was part of that big Eastern Bloc, the old USSR, has then emerged as a leading European EU member state, has benefited greatly economically. And yet here we are, 2024, and a Putin sympathizer, somebody who is anti-NATO, whose name you are going to pronounce for us correctly, he's in the final two. He's in the runoff for the presidency.
Mr.
James,
Kalin,
what's happening? What's happening?
Mr. Kalin Georgiescu. Yes, he is the far right candidate, and you're quite right. You'd think that those countries that had most experienced the Soviet bloc would be resistant to the Russian expansionism now, but of course, this is becoming a bit of a worrying pattern for the European Union, because obviously you've got Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's sort of generally pro-Russian. Slovakia is slightly pro-Russian. And when we come to what we were talking about earlier on, about whether Europe will be fully behind Ukraine in any peace negotiations, it's beginning to look a little bit dodgy. And it also, on a wider context, I think weakens the European Union, which, as I think we said in the last couple of weeks, I've always seen as a liberal trading bloc, but it's being threatened and challenged by the immigration issue and by the Russian aggression, and is not reacting in the way in which we thought it should do. My last point would be, I'm really glad, Frank, that you have brought these issues up on our little podcast, because the massive amount of coverage of the United States and its politics is in huge disproportion to these other important issues. I mean, obviously Ireland and Romania are not the same importance, but the underreporting of these things is really quite worrying. So we'll have to see whether, I mean, it's a first round. I think in Romania there's a runoff, and if we go by the French example, usually the extremist doesn't win, but it's a worrying sign in connection with the Ukraine crisis.
Yeah, very much so. And it does beg the question, doesn't it? We talk about poor communication strategy from the Labour Party and the Labour government. What the bloody hell is the EU doing? With its vast resource and the amount of cash that I know is spent on communications, and, the insistence on having the little flag on everything they put any money into. But that's not good enough. You've got to go and win people's hearts and minds, and it simply doesn't appear to be happening. They lost the UK, and you've got these big Eastern European nations now who have had literally billions of pounds poured into them of European funds to help rebuild those countries, boost their economies. And here we are with this disillusionment emerging and people showing Russian sympathies. It is, let's say, quite astonishing, really, and something we are going to have to keep an eye on, because you've mentioned France, Jim. You've got the German elections in February. And again, it looks as though the far right are going to do well there as well. So, yeah, very worrying times, very worrying times. Let's want to end on a more positive note today. It is on this very day, the 40th anniversary of the single Do They Know It's Christmas being released. It was Live Aid. Well, it was Band Aid, and then it obviously transitioned into Live Aid, which was a fantastic event that raised, obviously, many, many millions, if not billions of pounds for Africa. And Joe, you did work for the great man that is Bob Geldof. Bit of sniffiness around the whole project at the moment, I noticed over the weekend. And Ed Sheeran complaining that his voice is being used on the re-release today of that single, because Bob has continued with the project, continues to raise money for Africa. I can't understand it, Joe. Why would anybody want to criticise people continuing to raise cash for people who are in need of it?
Well, their argument is it's the white saviour complex, that it portrays Africa as, victim, constantly starving babies with flies crawling over their faces in a country that can't get on its feet. And Ed Sheeran, who, frankly, who cares what Ed Sheeran thinks? But, he's joined on this bandwagon. And there is probably some sense of people, Africans particularly, saying, actually, what about our history? What about our culture? We're not, we don't want to always be seen as a poor country, which is fine. And I don't think one cancels out the other. But I'm afraid, after 10 years of working with Bob, I'm with him on this. And as he said, for fuck's sake, look at the millions of lives that have been saved and look at what is happening. We've just been talking about climate change. Look at the crop failures. Look at the war in Sudan. Look at the wars in Africa. Look at the people in need. And all the time, the people are in need. And the other thing that's most important, we talk about politics on this because it's a politics podcast. How do you engage people with the bigger picture of politics? You do it through something like Band-Aid, Live Aid, Live 8, and all of that has engaged probably, now 2 generations, 3 generations of people who are aware of what's going on and actually what is not to like or applaud that. And it's not like Bob did it for the glory. He's been doing it for 40 bloody years.
No, all power to him, in my opinion. I don't know about you. I mean, Sheeran's a bloody Ipswich fan as well, so he doesn't cover himself in glory as far as that's concerned.
Oh yes, Ipswich, they finished second in the Division 1 title race in 2023 to another club that I shan't mention. I mean, on a serious note, of course, we've been talking about the appalling situations in Ukraine and Israel, but actually, in terms of displacement and everything else, the Sudan civil war, which is merely being fought between 2 generals, it has no ideological basis at all, is even worse. I think the only thing is, do they know it's Christmas? It's that particular lyric, isn't it? These poor ignorant people, they don't know. And Christmas is a Christian festival. It slightly smacks of it was appropriate in '84, not appropriate now. I don't know. Is that a question to be raised?
Bloody hell, Jim! You're getting us into cancel culture and wokeism. We're going to get into all sorts of trouble. I love the song. I'd urge people to buy it again. Do they know it's Christmas time? Great record, #1, and the best version I ever seen sang was on Gavin and Stacey. If you've not caught it, go on to iPlayer and have a look at Smithy blasting it out with Gavin. It's a great version of that particular song. Anyway, on that note, let us end what has been a longer than normal Downtown Den Politics podcast. Jim will tell me off because his stopwatch has gone off on more than one occasion, but then I'll make him listen back to the recording and he can see who made us run over. Right, guys, see you next week. Been great to have your company as ever. And next week, who knows what we'll be talking about. But of course, we will have had that assisting dying bill second reading, as Jim pointed out. We'll have also had the results from the Irish election, possibly the Romanian election as well. So I'm sure we won't be short of conversation. Have a great week, everyone, and look after yourselves.